Well, hey, you guys. Here I am once again for another Flickers of Fear movie review. So, what ended up happening was that the last movie review that I posted, which, if you remember, was Fright Night Part 2 from 1988, 1989, whatever. So, when I posted that a few days ago, somebody named Scott commented on the post that I had made on Facebook and said that he would very much, pretty please, like to see a review of the 1993 Stephen King adaptation, The Dark Half. Now, I could have sworn that Tom and I had reviewed that movie already, and I was just kind of like, I know we did. I just know it. And so I went back and looked at our back catalog, but nope, it's not there. And then it occurred to me as I was thinking about it, I was like, maybe I was thinking of Secret Window, because I know we did Secret Window, and the story of that is kind of similar. So maybe that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that we had done The Dark Half, but we actually did the other movie. But yeah, so it wasn't there. So I was like, well, what the hell? I saw that it was on Tubi for free, at least as of this recording, which is early March of 2024. And I decided to give it a rewatch. I will say this is about the third or fourth viewing of this movie for me. I've seen it like several times before, but I haven't seen it for a long time. I've also read the novel, which came out in 1989, at least 2 times, maybe more than that. But it's probably been at least like 20 years since I read it last time. But I will note that according to everybody that knows about these kind of things, and from what I can recall too, is that The Dark Half is generally considered one of the most faithful of all the King adaptations, as in faithful to the book. It changed very little. So the novel, most people probably know this and know anything about Stephen King, but he actually got the idea for The Dark Half from his own experiences writing under his pseudonym, Richard Bachman. And to an extent, for The Dark Half, the story behind it, he actually kind of fictionalized and sort of exaggerated the real life way that it was actually like a fan of his that ended up exposing his alter ego. Like, it wasn't, I kind of remember when it happened, but it's just kind of like it wasn't a massive deal. Not like not obviously not like in the book and in the subsequent movie, but you know, I remember it being kind of a thing and somebody finding his name on the publishing stuff and like coming out and saying, hey, Richard Bachman's really Stephen King, you know what I mean? But in the novel, I think King was more interested in playing with the idea that someone like a writer that invents this kind of alter ego can maybe run the risk of that creation taking on a life of its own. Because one of the things that he mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing here just from an interview that I read a long time ago, was that writing as Richard Bachman, he'd almost kind of started to develop his own like author's voice, like distinct from Stephen King's, you know what I mean? So he just kind of took that idea and ran with it. Now, one thing I had completely forgotten, I can't fucking believe I forgot this, but The Dark Half, the movie, was directed by none other than George A. Romero. Which, that blew my mind. I was like, holy crap, how could I have forgotten that? But in fact, that's kind of a big deal. But, you know, obviously Stephen King and George Romero worked together a lot before, probably most famously on Creepshow from 1982, which, again, probably my favorite horror anthology of all time. Actually, not even probably. It is my favorite horror anthology of all time. It's a great movie. I never get sick of it. But, you know, obviously The Dark Half is a completely different tone to Creepshow. It's a lot more serious. It's like psychological story. It kind of deals with the concept of duality and, you know, doppelgangers, evil twin sort of thing. And, you know, kind of a supernatural take on evil twins, or even like maybe a Jekyll and Hyde type narrative also. So the movie of The Dark Half was actually shot in 1991. But the distribution company, which was Orion, they had some problems with bankruptcy. They afterward like pulled out of it. But while in the early 90s, they were having like a lot of financial problems. So the movie actually ended up getting shelved for a couple of years. So it actually wasn't even released until 1993, but it was actually made a couple of years previously. And by the time that it came out, it kind of seemed like maybe audiences had like some Stephen King adaptation fatigue, perhaps, or maybe they were just kind of sick of the glut of crappy ones that had come out in the previous few years. I mean, obviously in the previous few years you had Misery from 1990, which was fantastic, but I think people had come to associate Stephen King adaptations with, you know, maybe stuff like Graveyard Shift or whatever, you know what I mean? So maybe like not not that good. So maybe they were kind of thinking that, and they're like, here's another one, we don't want to know. So audiences kind of stayed away. The movie didn't even make it cost $15 million to make, I think, which was a big budget for George Romero because he was so used to making everything on like little minuscule budgets, but it didn't even make that back. I don't even think it made 10 million. And the critical reviews at the time were mixed to negative, tended to be. I didn't really see that many positive reviews. And even today, like I looked at Rotten Tomatoes and it only has like a 59% rating on there. And I was like, that's kind of bullshit, in my opinion, I'm going to say. The Dark Half, it's not a classic, obviously, like, you know, on par with The Shining or Misery or anything like that. But it's a totally respectable adaptation. It has a really good central performance by Timothy Hutton, who's playing dual roles here, obviously. And it almost has, like I said, like a Jekyll and Hyde type of, almost like a slightly vaguely gothic sensibility to it, which I actually really enjoyed. So as I mentioned, Timothy Hutton plays the main role in this. So he plays Tad Beaumont. Now see, they call him Thad in the movie, and that kind of drives me crazy because I know that it's short for Thaddeus, and I know that some people that have that name and they shorten it to THAD do pronounce it Thad, but I was just like, I've never met anybody like that. It's like most of the time you just pronounce it Tad, so that's what I'm going to say, even though through the movie they said Thad, and I was like, it's just driving me crazy. But yeah, so Tad is a successful novelist and also a creative writing teacher, much as Stephen King was. And he has a wife named Liz, who's played by Amy Madigan, and they have twin baby boys. Now, at the very beginning of the movie, there's kind of like a little bit of a prologue of Tad as a kid, and they're kind of showing his burgeoning interest in writing and stuff like that. But he starts having these really bad, like devastating headaches and like hearing phantom sounds of like birds and stuff. And so he gets taken to the hospital because obviously this is kind of an alarming development. And it's discovered eventually that he has a tumor in his brain that is it's a partially absorbed twin, which, like I said, that does actually happen probably more often than you think. So they kind of open his brain up in actually a pretty gory scene. It was pretty well done. And there's like a big, like a blinking eye in there, and there's like some other pieces of this baby. So yeah, that's a little scary. So yeah, so the tissue gets removed and everything seems fine. Like he comes through the surgery, no problem. But right after the surgery, the hospital gets just besieged by this enormous flock of sparrows, which the whole situation just doesn't seem entirely natural. Let's say that. So then we come into the present day, and Tad is working on his newest book, which, you know, his wife is reading it like as he's going, and it's like she thinks it's going to be his best book ever, and blah, blah, blah. So Tad, you learn, is kind of like a real highbrow sort of novelist, right? Like the kind that wins Pulitzer Prizes and whatnot. But these types of novels that he writes obviously don't sell all that well to, you know, John Q. Public. Tad actually makes the bulk of his money because it's shown that he's, you know, he's not super, super rich, but he's upper middle class, you know what I mean? So he makes most of his money writing these really violent, sleazy, kind of morally questionable crime thrillers under a pseudonym, George Stark. And these books sell like hotcakes. And these particular stories have a central character named Alexis Machine, who is like a cold-blooded killer. And as the story goes on, you're kind of led to believe that Tad almost like admires this guy because he just does whatever the hell he wants to do, like without worrying about any repercussions. And he almost kind of wants to be like that in a little bit of a way. So yeah, that kind of like feeds into his character as well. We also learn that while Tad is just a really nice man, like a good guy, he's a good dad, he's a good husband, he's pretty chill. But whenever he's working on one of the George Stark novels, as opposed to one of his own, you know, hoity-toity novels, his whole personality changes. Like he starts smoking and drinking again, even though he quit doing both of those things like a long time ago. He says like mean shit to his wife, and it's like he gets like a real bad temper, like he gets real cranky and shit like that. And another thing, too, another quirk that he has is that he always writes his George Stark books in longhand with a specific kind of pencil, which is called the Black Beauty, even though Tad always uses a typewriter. And this is kind of like going back a little bit to the prologue when you saw him as a kid, because that's what he always wrote with, those types of pencils, and he always wrote in longhand. So it's almost kind of like, I don't know, like going back to childhood or going back to like his more primitive state or whatever. So it's like whenever he does the George Stark books, he always writes with those pencils, and he always writes in longhand. So not too long into the movie, this squirrely fucker named Fred Clausen, who's played by Robert Joy, he shows up in one of Tad's creative writing classes, and he gives him like a George Stark book, and he's like, hey, can I have your autograph? And Tad's like, that's not my book. Like, look at the picture on the back. It's not me, and blah, blah, blah. But Fred is totally onto him. He's like, look, I know that's a fake picture. I know this is your pseudonym. It's like, I went out. He's like, he slept with a woman, Fred did, who worked at Tad's publishing company. And apparently after the lovin', she like spilled the whole story, right? So Fred is now asking for money to keep his fat trap shut about the whole situation. Like, he's kind of banking on the fact that Tad doesn't want anybody in his big little fancy, you know, literary circles finding out that he has this real lucrative side gig in writing kind of just like pulpy trash, as most people would consider it. Now, to an extent, Fred's instincts in this regard are correct, and Tad doesn't really want anybody to know about it. But when Tad tells his wife about this whole dilemma, because Fred is like, well, I'll give you a few days to think about it, and then I'll call you and we'll establish a payment plan. But he's thought this through, like, obviously. But she's like, okay, well, why don't you go public with the information first, like, before he can do it? Because then you took the wind out of his sails. Like, now everybody knows, and he doesn't have anything to blackmail you with. And he's like, oh, duh. I mean... It's like, it's so elegant in its simplicity. I don't know why I didn't think of that. I was like, see, that's why you need to have her around, because she kind of thinks about that kind of stuff. So he actually calls his agent and his publishers and everything like that. And it's like, you know, I'm going to go public with the George Starr thing. Is that okay? And they were like, yeah, go for it. They're like, it'll drum up publicity. It's like, you might sell more books, you know, by your actual name, under your actual name, instead of just the George Stark. It's like, it's, you know, it's win-win. We can't lose. So he's actually like a pretty famous writer. So they call up like People Magazine, and they're gonna the crew from People Magazine is gonna go up to their little vacation cabin up in, you know, Stephen King's town of Castle Rock, and they're gonna take some pictures for the magazine, right? Now, one of the pictures that they take is this kind of jokey picture, which has Tad and his wife Liz standing in front of this fake gravestone that they set up that has George Stark's name on it, because he's like, oh, I'm burying, you know, my pseudonym. It's like, I'm coming out with it. I wrote all these books, but I'm not going to write them anymore. So the headstone has George Stark's name on it, and the death date and everything like that, and also has like a little epitaph on it that said, not a very nice guy. Now, significantly, the photo shoot, they stage it in the cemetery in Castle Rock, and they're like, well, we needed an empty plot because we thought it would be disrespectful to like take pictures over like an actual dead person. So like, we found this empty plot that actually belongs to your family. Like, that's where his parents were buried. And I guess his parents had bought him a plot too. So that's like, I'm like, that's a little weird, but okay. Happy birthday. Here's a cemetery plot. But yeah, so I kind of thought that, but yeah, it has to be like that for the story to work. But so it's supposedly an empty plot that's like right next to his parents' graves. And he said, you know, is that okay? And he's just like, yeah, that's fine. So they set it up. Now, as you might have surmised from the way that this story is going, George Stark has become, I guess, like such a forceful part of Tad's psyche that he has essentially become a separate human being, like a real physical human being. Now, he has the same fingerprints, and I would presume the same DNA, because I guess it's kind of like a twin. But, you know, that's kind of going back to the whole thing where he had the parasitic twin, like, in his brain at the end. There, you know, even though it's supernatural the way he came into being, like, he is an actual twin, like an actual person. So because he has the same fingerprints, I mean, this was still 1993, so they didn't really, and the novel was written in the late 80s, so they didn't really have, like, a lot of DNA kind of stuff. But because his fingerprints are the same as Tad's, this causes just a tiny, tiny problem when George Stark digs his way out of that empty grave, like where they did the photo shoot, and pretty much starts killing everybody that had anything to do with that whole publicity stunt where he was supposedly killed off. So Stark's shit list, if you want to call it that, starts with this kind of doddering old guy who's like a photographer. He was the one that took the picture. And the local police come to Tad's house because his bloody fingerprints are all over the dead guy's truck, like the inside of the truck. Because, like, he drove the truck somewhere else, you know what I mean? So Tad is just completely beside himself at this news because he tells the police, and he's telling the truth. He's like, look, I just got back from New York City. There's no way that I could have murdered that guy, which, like I said, it was true. They did show him coming back and everything like that. So you have the sheriff, Alan Pangborn, who is actually in this movie is played by Michael Rooker, who I love Michael Rooker. He's great in everything. But yeah, he's awesome in this movie. The same character, Alan Pangborn, he shows up in like several of Stephen King's stories. And as a matter of fact, he was played by Ed Harris in Needful Things, which was another Stephen King adaptation, which came out the same year as this one. But it's the same character. So Pangborn is a friend of Tad's and knows that Tad is a good guy and would probably not do anything like that. Like, he didn't really have any reason to. So he's kind of like willing to cut him some slack, but he's still pretty sus, you know what I mean? And it's like there's kind of like the state police guys are there and they're just kind of like, I mean, this seems open and shut. Like, his fingerprints are all over the shit, but he's like, no, there's got to be some other explanation, you know what I mean? But, you know, I have to say, like, things not looking too good in the whole Tad being possibly a stone cold murderer situation. Now, Liz, though, she comes up with the idea. She's like, oh, I bet I know what it is. Remember that shifty ass blackmailer, Fred Clausen? It's like, I bet he's trying to like set you up because he was mad that you scooped him and like went out and he didn't get the money, right? So she's like, you need to go investigate that dude. However, when police go to Fred's apartment, which is in New York City, they find his ass dead too. And the way that he was killed is very specific. And previously, Tad had made a joke to his wife about what should happen to Fred because he was so mad about him blackmailing him. Now, nobody else was there except for Tad and his wife and the babies. And he was just like, yeah, you know what they do to like people that rat people out or something like that? They cut their dicks off and like stuff them down their throat or something. He's like, that's what Alexis Machine, his character, would do. And so he says that to his wife and she's like, bro, chill out, you know what I mean? But it's kind of like that. But see, that's how the real Fred actually ends up dead. They don't show it. They just, it was kind of elegant, actually. This is a fairly gory movie, but some of the kills they don't show as much. And obviously they're going to run into problems like showing somebody dead with like a penis stuffed in their mouth. So what they did was they just kind of showed it in shadow, like in silhouette, which I thought was like was like an obvious like dick sticking out of the guy's mouth, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, so that's how he died. Now, obviously, like I said, the cops don't know that Tad said that to his wife, but his wife is just kind of like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, she's kind of starting to look askance. But the thing about it is that she never ever believed that Tad was the killer. I think as far as she ever went was she thought, well, maybe you're blacking out and doing it without remembering, but she seemed like to stick by him the whole time. Like, she didn't like look at him being like, bro, are you doing that? You know what I mean? Like, she really kind of like stayed on his side the whole time, which I thought was pretty cool. The other thing too is that Fred died in New York City, but he was killed when Tad was still in New York City, so he doesn't have an alibi this time, right? So because of this, you know, the state police and everything like are really, really wanting to arrest Tad, but Pangborn is kind of able to, you know, talk them out or stave it off for a little while longer. And as the story goes on, it starts to become clearer, even to the cops, that Tad, whatever is going on, cannot be responsible for the crimes. Because, I mean, they put him under surveillance, they're watching him all the time, but people keep turning up dead anyway. Like his agent, like his agent's ex-wife, who also works for the publishing company, the woman from the publishing company that slept with Fred, that, you know, kind of spilled the beans about the George Stark thing, like she ends up murdered. I think they don't show that, that's like off screen, but they mention it later on. So people are dying anyway, and the cops are like, well, this, eventually they come to the thing, it's like, well, this is somebody that has it in for you, obviously, and they're just trying to set you up, because they're like, we were looking right at you, and like when all of these people were getting killed elsewhere, like a lot of people got killed in New York City when he was still in Maine. So Tad is kind of desperate, so finally he calls Pangborn and he gives a description of the supposedly fictional George Stark to the cops. He's like, basically, the dude looks a lot like me, but he's kind of like broader, more muscular, rougher looking. He has kind of like slicked back hair, kind of like a, like a duck ass kind of thing, like Elvis. And he has a car. He's like, he'll be driving a black Oldsmobile Toronado with the words "high-toned son of a bitch" emblazoned across the back, like across the trunk. Now, Tad, meanwhile, is starting to do some of his own investigation, because at this point he has determined, he's like, well, George Stark, somehow, he's like, I don't know how the fuck this happened, but George Stark has obviously come to life somehow and is killing people and fucking with me. And obviously the cops don't believe that because it's supernatural, but he's like, yeah, that's what it looks like is happening. So he's going to try and do his own investigation, like on the down low. So he actually goes back to his childhood home and goes back to the doctor where he had the tumor removal surgery as a kid. And the doctor is still there, and he kind of asks about it. Now, Tad was never told after the surgery that the tumor was a parasitic twin. So, like, he didn't know that that's... And he's like, oh, okay, well, that explains a lot. And they also didn't tell him about the flock of sparrows that kind of, like, flew and, like, mobbed the hospital, like, after the operation. But once he finds out those two bits of information, he's like, oh, my God, like, now everything makes so much more sense, because... up to this point, like, Tad has sometimes been blacking out, which, like I said, I think they kind of want you to think maybe that he is blacking out and doing this stuff, even though when you're watching the movie, it's obvious because it's two different characters. But I can't remember if he left it ambiguous in the book, like, for longer. But he does kind of, like, black out sometimes. And when he blacks out sometimes, like, sometimes he'll start writing, like automatic writing, like, on a piece of paper. And one of the things that he keeps writing is the sparrows are flying again. And he did write that, and... Alan Pangborn tells them it's like at least one of the murder scenes, I think it was the Fred Clausen one, like that same phrase was written on the wall in blood. Now, according to another teacher that he knows, as she teaches like folklore or something like that, she says that sparrows are sometimes considered psychopomps, which is kind of like a Greek thing. These are beings, they're usually gods or something like that, but they can take animal form, and they escort souls from the land of the living to the land of the dead. So that's the significance of the sparrows. So the doctor actually gets horribly murdered by George Stark while Tad is still in the office, like in another part of the office. So Tad has to obviously get the fuck out of Dodge before he gets blamed for that shit too. And he also finds out, or he doesn't really find it out, but he surmises correctly, as it turns out, that George Stark can't actually kill him, because Stark only exists because Tad made him real, right? But obviously, if you've been watching the movie up to this point, Stark can absolutely kill any other person, just not him. So he's basically threatening to do just that. He's like, look, I'm going to kill your family, his wife and his two babies, unless you write a new George Stark book. So the implication is that if he writes a new George Stark book, George will actually be able to take over Tad's life and be a real person, while Tad will kind of slowly deteriorate to nothing. It's almost like they're both like fighting over the same soul. You know what I mean? It's like a push and pull, a tug of war type of thing. Like, because throughout the movie, like, Stark is getting, like, he looks sicker and sicker, like some of his skin's like kind of peeling off, and he just like, and his eyes are going all milky and stuff. And then like toward the end, when Tad and Stark are kind of battling for the same soul, like they kind of trade off, like looking shitty, like no matter, depending on who it is that has like the more power at that moment. So like I said, they're just kind of essentially, like I said, it's one soul, but they're kind of like fighting over which body is gonna take it over. You know what I'm saying? So at the end, of course, if you've read the novel, Tad is victorious. And I will say too that it's like, it's funny because this whole time, like the cop, he's like, look, I know he didn't really think it was supernatural, even up until the end when crazy shit was going on. He's like, I just think this is a person that knows a buck ton about you and is like trying to make it look like you're a murderer. Like somehow, we're not really sure how he's doing it. But at the very end, when there's the big battle royale, like at the cabin, Alan Pangborn shows up just in time, because I was like, wouldn't it be a bitch if like he didn't show up like until after the whole thing was over and they still thought that like Tad was a murderer? I was like, wow, that would really suck. but yeah, that doesn't happen. Like, he shows up exactly at the last minute, because what happens is, basically George Stark gets, Tad gets, kind of the jump on him and stabs him with a pencil and all this other kind of stuff. And then, like, all the sparrows come and, like, try to take him away. So they take him away, like, in pieces. You know what I mean? So Alan Pangborn comes in there just in time to see the last little scraps of, like, the sparrows coming and, like, pecking all his little bones and skin and, like, taking him away piece by piece. Like, and so he's just, like, a bloody skeleton. And so he got carried back to this netherworld where he came from, like, up in the sky. And Pangborn's like, oh, I guess this was supernatural after all. I'll be damned. But yeah. So that was how that ended. So I'm going to say, like, okay, as Stephen King adaptations go, this is definitely in the higher end of the middle range. You know what I mean? Because there's a 3-tier system, which I talked about in my history of horror movies video, the 3-tier Stephen King adaptation system. And this one is definitely middle range, but very, very high in the middle range. I like that it took itself seriously, like it took the story seriously, because I do kind of feel like some, depending on the director, I guess, some Stephen King adaptations tended a little bit toward goofy, and like sometimes the characters would be goofy, like with all their funny little catchphrases and stuff. This has a tiny bit of that. Like there's one character that keeps saying, well, he doesn't keep saying it, but he says it like 2 or 3 times, like ask mama if she believes this or something like that. Because you know how I think I've mentioned it before, but like a lot of times Stephen King characters will have little catchphrases and they'll kind of say them over and over. And it's like, it doesn't really, you don't notice it as much in a book, but like in a movie, when you can hear it, it's just like if somebody keeps saying it over and over, you're just like, oh my God, please stop saying that. So it's like this one had a tiny bit of that, but so minuscule that it's like much better. Because I don't really like that. So I like that this kept the goofiness to a minimum. That was very much appreciated. All of the acting performances across the board are good. Timothy Hutton's good in it. Madigan is good in it. Michael Rooker is good. He's always good in everything. But yeah, he was good in this too. Like I said, there's a decent amount of gore. It's a compelling story. You pretty much know what's going on, but there's like a lot of, suspense and everything like that too. Now, I will say the special effects toward the end, like where George Stark gets, carried away piece by piece by the sparrows, tad subpar. But that's mainly because they had to be shot later after, Orion Pictures kind of shit the bed with the whole financial thing. So they actually didn't get to shoot that until later, and I guess it was kind of rushed and they didn't have as much money to do it as they thought they would. But that said, it doesn't look that bad. It looks like a little bit, because I think even George Romero said he thought it looked like garbage. It's not that bad. It's really not. I've seen way worse in movies that came out later than this. So I would not call it that. It's just, like I said, it's just slightly below par, but it's really not all that noticeable. So, now, so there might not be much inherent cinematic drama in a story about a guy wanting another guy to write a book, because that's pretty much what the plot of this is. But honestly, I really think this was well done. I think the pacing is well done. Like I said, there's a lot of suspense because George Stark is like, he's a real bad guy. He's like evil, and he'll just like go and do all these horrible things. And he's just getting nearer and nearer. And the fact that he's doing all these things and everybody thinks it's Tad, that's really compelling. So I thought that was really well done. You can tell that Timothy Hutton is having an absolute blast playing George Stark, because he just gets to be just a complete shithead. You know what I mean? He's just like the fucking worst. He's like a serial killer. And it's kind of also cool that as Tad, he comes across like a lot different. Like he comes across as just kind of like a likable everyman type character. But he does have like a few personality quirks that are kept subtle, but they still like inform his character. I like that. I think Romero made a good choice, if it was indeed his choice, or maybe it was Timothy Hutton's choice. But he has Timothy Hutton's character as Tad. He kind of has a little bit of things where he's like kind of clumsy. You know what I mean? Like he'll like run into stuff, but they don't overdo it, and they don't draw attention to it. You know what I mean? It's just like it happens a couple of times, and you're just like, oh, I get it. He's kind of klutzy. You know what I mean? But they don't. Nobody says, oh, you're so klutzy or anything like that. They don't draw attention to it. And I thought that was like a really good, because you still got it, but it wasn't like, they didn't beat you over the head with it. So I thought that was like really good. It was like really subtle. And I don't know. I like that kind of character work like that. So I really appreciated that as well. Weirdly, I kind of feel like the main criticism I saw of this from contemporary reviews, not so much new ones, but I think what a lot of people didn't like about it was they were like, well, I didn't really like that the mythology behind how George Stark came to be wasn't really explained. And I was like, how much more explaining did you want? You know what I mean? Like I said, horror movies, they suffer when you over-explain them. It's like, look, the kid had a parasitic twin. You know, he has this alter ego that he writes under books under. It's like, and it came to life. End of story. Like, you don't need any more explanation than that. It's supernatural, okay? Just roll with it. I don't really understand, like, how much more explanation they really needed. I think that's a dumb criticism. But yeah, that's just my opinion. So, I don't know. So, tell me if you agree with me or not. But yeah, so I kind of feel like the dark half, it honestly, it doesn't get brought up all that much when people talk about, you know, the decent King adaptations, and I'm gonna say that kind of sucks because it's a really solid movie, and honestly I hadn't seen it for many years, and it was much better than I remembered from the last time. I remembered liking it the last time I watched it, but when I watched it this time I'm like, oh, that was like much better than I remembered it being. So if you haven't seen it for a while, you know, give it another spin. I think it's aged really well, and I think it's definitely a Stephen King adaptation that probably needs more love and attention, because like I said, it seems like it kind of fell through the cracks a little bit, and it didn't really, you know, make any money, and which is just kind of shitty. So, you know, it's on Tubi, at least as of this recording, so you can watch it for free if you haven't seen it in a little while, and I would recommend you do that if you like Stephen King adaptations. And that will do it for this Flickers of Fear. I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.